The torches cast long shadows across the marble floor. You can hear your own heartbeat above the murmur of voices behind you. Your hands are trembling, not from cold, but from something else entirely. 7 witnesses stand in the darkness, their eyes tracking your movement toward the corner of the room where something waits beneath draped cloth. You've been told this is sacred, that every woman before you has done the same, that refusing would destroy your family's honor, but no one told you what it actually was, not until now, not until your fingers reach for the fabric and pull it back. Before we go deeper into this story, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you right now? It amazes me that a ritual from 2,000 years ago can reach people across every continent today. Drop a comment and let me know. Her name was Claudia Marcella. She was 17 years old. The year was 76 CE, during the reign of Emperor Vespasian, and this was her wedding night. Not the public ceremony earlier that day, the one with saffron veils and scattered walnuts, the one her family's guests had witnessed with approval and celebration. This was what came after. What happened behind closed doors in the presence of strangers whose sole purpose was to watch, to verify, to testify in court if needed that the property transfer had been completed according to law. Because that's what Roman marriage actually was. Not a romantic union, not a partnership of equals. It was a legal transaction involving the transfer of property, and the property being transferred was a woman's body, her fertility, her capacity to produce legitimate heirs. Roman law required documentation for property transfers. It required witnesses. It required verification that what was promised had been delivered. And the Romans applied this same merciless logic to their daughters. What Claudia was about to experience had been carefully designed over centuries. Every element served a legal purpose. Every ritual answered a question that Roman law demanded be answered. The system was so thorough, so embedded in the fabric of Roman life, that generations of women passed through it, believing there was no alternative. And when Christianity finally conquered Rome 3 centuries later, the Church Fathers would work systematically to erase every trace of what had actually happened in those torch-lit rooms, to bury the evidence so deeply that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage really required. But fragments survive. They always do. The wedding ceremony earlier that day had been beautiful in its way. Claudia had worn the traditional flammeum, the flame-colored veil that marked her as a bride. Her hair had been arranged in the sine-crined 6 braids bound with wool ribbons, styled exactly as Roman brides had worn their hair for 700 years. At the temple, the sacrifice had gone smoothly. The sheep's entrails showed favorable omens, the augur confirming that the gods smiled upon this union. Her father, Marcus Claudius Severus, had signed the marriage contracts using the ancient legal formulas, transferring his daughter from his potestas, his absolute legal authority, to the authority of her new husband, Lucius Valerius Flaccus, a senator's son she had met exactly 4 times before this day. She had spoken the ritual words every bride spoke, ubi to Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia. The phrase used the old traditional names, but its meaning was clear. She was surrendering her individual identity. She belonged to her husband now, absorbed into his household as completely as if she had been born there. The procession through Rome's streets had been accompanied by songs. Fescennine verses, they were called bawdy, obscene, shockingly explicit. Young men in the crowd had shouted graphic descriptions of what would happen to her that night. their words so crude that Claudia's face burned beneath her veil. Her mother had assured her this was tradition, that the obscene songs drove away evil spirits through the power of laughter and embarrassment. But Claudia had noticed her mother wasn't laughing. Her mother had wept while dressing her that morning, and her final whispered words had sounded less like advice and more like warning. Do not resist. Whatever they require of you, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. They reached the house of Lucius Valerius Flaccus as darkness fell completely. 2 torches flanked the doorway, marking this as a place where a marriage would be consummated according to law. The crowd's songs grew louder, more insistent. Someone threw walnuts, a fertility blessing that struck her shoulders and caught in the folds of her dress, feeling less like blessing and more like mockery. Lucius lifted her across the threshold. Tradition said it was unlucky for a bride to stumble entering her new home, but the gesture symbolized something older, something from an era when women were carried into their husbands' houses whether they wished to enter or not. The door closed behind her, muffling the singing outside, and Claudia saw what was waiting. An elderly woman in formal robes stood in the atrium of Pronuba, whose role was to oversee everything that would happen tonight. Beside her, a priest in ceremonial dress, 3 female slaves carrying basins and cloths, an older man with a leather bag of medical instruments resting at his feet, and in the corner, nearly 4 feet tall, draped in fabric that concealed its exact shape, a wooden structure that would change everything. The Pronuba stepped forward and took Claudia's hands in a grip that was firm, almost restraining, as though she expected the girl to try to flee. "Welcome to your husband's home," the Pronuba said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was absolutely inflexible. The sacred rites must now be completed. What almost no one tells you about Roman marriage is this: it was not legally valid until consummated. The consummation had to be verified by witnesses, because how else could anyone be certain it had occurred? The bride's virginity had to be confirmed, because how else could the husband be certain that any children she bore were his? These were not cultural preferences. They were legal requirements, as binding as any clause in a property contract, and each requirement generated its own ritual. The Pronuba guided Claudia toward the draped figure in the corner. Claudia's heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears, feel it pulsing in her throat. The Pronuba's hand remained on her arm firm, guiding, allowing no retreat. "You must greet Mutinus Tutunus," the Pronuba said. "You must ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Claudia reached out with trembling hands and pulled back the cloth. What stood beneath was a wooden figure carved with anatomical precision into the shape of a phallus. But this was not a small amulet like the ones that hung around children's necks to ward off the evil eye. This was not a garden statue meant to frighten intruders. This figure was life-sized, proportioned carefully, mounted at a specific height, and its purpose became horrifyingly clear as the Pronuba began explaining what Claudia must do. The god Mutinus Tutunus was Rome's deity of fertility and sexual initiation. We know he existed because multiple ancient sources mention him, always briefly, always with visible discomfort, as though the writers themselves were embarrassed by what they were describing. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity was conquering pagan Rome, described the practice with outrage. Roman brides were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of Mutinus Tutunus as a sacred duty before consummation with their husbands. The ritual was performed in the presence of witnesses. Augustine was a hostile source, writing specifically to condemn paganism and make the old Roman ways seem barbaric. But his description matches fragments from earlier non-Christian texts. Lactantius, another church father, called it so shameful that even naming it pollutes the speaker. Arnobius provided slightly more detail, describing brides made to straddle the god's emblem, their new husbands looking on. The antiquarian Varro, writing centuries earlier with no Christian agenda, mentioned Mutinus Tutunus as a deity to whom brides were presented, using language that implied physical contact without explicitly describing it. Modern historians who address this ritual at all tend to minimize it. They suggest the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic gesture, a quaint fertility blessing that feels less invasive. But the language of the ancient sources does not support this comfortable interpretation. Augustine's word was insidir, which means to mount, to settle onto with weight and pressure. Arnobius used language implying penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the details specifically because they were too shameful, which seems an excessive reaction to someone briefly touching a statue. The stated purpose was to seek divine blessing for fertility, but the practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have consciously acknowledged, was preparation. It was breaking down resistance before the real consummation occurred. It was demonstrating absolute submission before witnesses. It was conditioning a virgin bride to accept what would follow. Claudia stood before the figure. The pronuba positioned her body, guided her movements, instructed her in what was required. The witnesses watched. Her husband watched. The physician waited to perform his examination afterward, and Claudia understood finally what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been preparing her for, what being a Roman wife actually required. She could have refused, theoretically, but refusal meant disgrace for her family, nullification of the contracts. Returned to her father's house as damaged goods no respectable man would marry. It meant everything she had been taught about duty. Honor and virtue would be proven false, and she would be proven worthless. She did not refuse. After the ritual with the statue, slaves washed her in the basin of scented water. The washing had religious significance, purifying her after the encounter with the god. But it was also practical preparation for what came next. The medical examination. The physician who had been standing silent throughout now approached. This examination was not optional. Before any wedding involving significant property, and Claudia's marriage involved substantial dowry and inheritance rights, a respectable Roman bride underwent verification by a physician or midwife to confirm her virginal status. The examination was documented. The documentation became part of the legal record establishing the bride's value. Roman medical text described the techniques used with clinical precision that leaves no ambiguity about what was involved. Soranus of Ephesus, writing his gynecology during this exact period, detailed the physical signs physicians should look for when examining virgins versus non-virgins. This wasn't theoretical medicine. It was practical instruction for a procedure wealthy Romans routinely demanded. The pre-wedding examination had established a baseline. Claudia was confirmed intact, never having belonged to another man. Now, after the ritual with Mutinus Tutunus, the physician performed a second examination. This verified that the ritual had been properly completed, that her physical state was consistent with what the earlier examination had established, that she was prepared for consummation with her husband. All of this occurred in the presence of witnesses whose testimony might be required if any aspect of the marriage was ever legally challenged. What strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions is not just their invasiveness, but their casualness. The Romans did not view these rituals as traumatic or problematic. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined, observed, and documented were no more relevant than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures. After the examination, Claudia was led to the bedchamber that had been prepared for consummation. The room had been decorated according to tradition, with the marriage bed positioned for optimal visibility from the doorway, which would remain open throughout the night. Oil lamps provided sufficient light for the pronuba to observe from her position near the entrance. The slaves who would be needed afterward stood ready in the corridor. Lucius entered. He seemed nervous, which surprised Claudia. She had assumed he would be confident, commanding. Instead, he glanced toward the pronuba with something like embarrassment before approaching the bed. The pronuba spoke, her voice formal and ritualistic. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife. What followed took several hours. The pronuba observed throughout, occasionally providing instruction when necessary, ensuring the consummation was completed in ways that would satisfy legal requirements. The door remained open. Sounds carried into the corridor where slaves waited. Everything that happened in that bed was semi-public, part of a verification ritual designed to ensure that no aspect of the property transfer could later be disputed. At dawn, the physician returned for a final examination. This confirmed that consummation had occurred, that the bride was now physically changed in ways that marked her transition from virgin to wife. The examination was documented. The pronuba provided formal testimony regarding what she had witnessed. The witnesses signed statements that would be filed with the marriage contracts. The legal transformation was complete. Claudia Marcella was now a Roman wife. She would bear 5 children over the next 12 years. She would manage her husband's household competently, earning respect from her mother-in-law and praise from her husband's colleagues. She would attend festivals, make appropriate sacrifices, fulfill all duties expected of a matron of her status, and she would never speak about her wedding night. Not to her sisters. Not even to her own daughters when their marriages were arranged, because what was there to say? It was tradition. It was how things had always been done. It was what being a Roman wife required. Her silence was not unusual. It was universal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they witnessed. The rituals were so embedded in Roman life that describing them seemed unnecessary, like describing how one breathes or eats. Everyone knew. No one spoke of it. This is why reconstructing these practices requires piecing together fragments from hostile Christian sources, obscure legal references, embarrassed medical texts, and archaeological evidence that only makes sense when you understand what it was designed for. The silence wasn't conspiracy. It was simply how deeply embedded these practices were. The water Roman women swam in, so omnipresent that describing it seemed pointless. For nearly 1,000 years, this was what marriage meant in Rome. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework, understood their experiences through this lens, passed their knowledge to their daughters in whispers that prepared the next generation while revealing nothing to outsiders. The system perpetuated itself because everyone involved accepted its fundamental premises. Property must be verified. Transfers must be witnessed. Marriage creates legal obligations requiring documentation. Women are the medium through which families continue. The logic was internally consistent, even as it was externally monstrous. The end came not from internal Roman reform, but from external religious conquest. When Christianity transformed Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, it brought fundamentally different premises. If women had souls equal to men, they could not be treated as property requiring examination. If marriage was a sacred mystery reflecting Christ's relationship with the Church, it could not include elements the Church considered obscene. If modesty and privacy were virtues, the entire apparatus of witnesses and verification was offensive. The transition took centuries and was never entirely complete. Pagan practices survived in rural areas long after urban elites had converted. But in cities among educated classes, the old ways were systematically suppressed, and the suppression included destruction of evidence. Statues of mutinous Teutonus were smashed or buried. Texts describing wedding night practices were removed from libraries or allowed to decay. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed. The pronuba's role was transformed into something purely ceremonial, a matron who helped dress the bride, nothing more. Within a few generations, detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings had actually involved was lost to everyone except scholars studying fragmentary surviving sources. The Christians who transformed Rome weren't simply erasing embarrassing history. They were trying to build a new civilization on Roman foundations while denying what those foundations had actually supported. They succeeded so well that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage really involved. The comfortable myth of saffron veils and scattered walnuts replaced the uncomfortable reality. But fragments survive. In the angry denunciations of church fathers trying to make paganism look barbaric, in medical texts that describe procedures without quite explaining why they were necessary, in legal documents that reference requirements without detailing how they were fulfilled, in archaeological finds that make no sense until you understand what they were used for. Fragments always survive. Claudia Marcella died in the year 118 CE at approximately age 59. She had been a wife for 42 years. What did she think about her wedding night and all those decades that followed? Did she remember it as trauma, as acceptance, as something between? Did she wish something different for her daughters? Or did she accept that this was simply how things were, how they had always been, how they would always be? We cannot know. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. The silence that surrounds these practices is the silence of women whose experiences were not considered worth recording, whose feelings about their own bodies were not considered relevant to the histories and legal texts that men produced. We know what was done to them. We do not know what they thought about what was done, but we know enough to understand why this history was erased. It revealed something uncomfortable about the civilization we have inherited. Rome is supposed to be the foundation of Western law, culture, architecture, governance.